Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Uncanny X-Men 6, cover dated July of 1964. The issue was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby, inked by Chick Stone, and lettered by Sam Rosen. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, showing the X-Men as they're sitting around a table and enjoying a meal, one that was graciously prepared by Jean. She's evidently quite the chef, and has even baked a delicious blueberry pie. And it's apparently so delicious that Bobby neglects to eat it with a fork. But the professor has strict rules about table manners, and Jean takes it upon herself to enforce them, by levitating the pie away from Bobby before he can take a bite. Watching his teammate act so childishly, Warren remarks that he can't believe that they're indeed Homo superior mutants, and not just regular humans. Professor X then speaks up and reminds him that aside from their powers, they really are no different from them. Thinking about this, Jean asks if there might be any mutants living amongst humans that they don't even know about. The professor tells her that there likely are, and it's their mission to find them before the evil mutants do. Then looking down at the day's paper, Professor X notices that on its cover is a photo of Prince Namor the Submariner, whose wild adventures have been much publicized. He wonders if Namor might actually be a mutant, and remarks that if he were, he'd be a powerful ally. But at the same time, if he were to be found by the evil mutants first, he might prove to be a dangerous enemy. The professor knows they can't take that chance, and thus declares that they must find Namor immediately. But little does he know that Magneto has come to the exact same conclusion. Having been defeated by the X-Men 3 times now, the Master of Magnetism has realized that he and his Brotherhood cannot defeat the X-Men alone. But with Namor on their side, they'd be unstoppable. So he prepares to find him, and once he does, he'll force him into submission. To this end, he's built an incredibly powerful laser gun to use against him. But he'll have to use it against Cyclops first, as the young hero has inexplicably appeared behind him. Reacting quickly, Magneto blasts the hero before he can release one of his optic beams, but oddly, the laser passes straight through him, and begins barreling towards the Scarlet Witch, who's cluelessly standing behind him. With his super-fast reflexes and speed, Quicksilver's just barely able to outrace the laser and push his sister out of harm's way. Obviously Cyclops hasn't randomly invaded Magneto's lair, it was just an illusion cast by Mastermind. While the wicked mutant claims that he was just practicing his power and meant no harm, Magneto angrily blasts him anyways. But he doesn't have time to punish Mastermind, his priority is to find Namor before the X-Men. So he rests himself on a large chair, and using his vast mental power, enters the astral plane to search for Namor. Meanwhile, Professor X is preparing to do the same, as he's ordered his students to train in the danger room, while he heads into his quiet study and enters the astral plane. With his consciousness removed from his body, Professor X's legs are restored to normal, and he can thus travel on foot. But without being tied to a physical body, he can do far more than just walk. For example, he can survive underwater, and taking advantage of this, he heads into the deep ocean to search for Namor. But what he ends up finding is Magneto, yet he isn't ready to confront his nemesis, and thus frantically leaves. So the issue shifts its focus to the Master of Magnetism, who after much searching, stumbles onto an undersea castle. It of course belongs to Namor, who's currently throwing a bitter tantrum, as one of his evil schemes was recently foiled by the Fantastic Four. This humiliating defeat, among several, forced his subjects to abandon him, and he's now left with only a few royal servants. But the sight of them reminds him of his bygone glory days, so he angrily orders them to leave his chamber at once. They obey him, and flee into the nearby hallways, but that's exactly where Magneto had been observing Namor, and where one of the servants now senses his presence. But Magneto can also sense the servant, and more specifically the greed and envy in his heart. So he offers him an opportunity to replace Namor as king. While he's at first hesitant, the servant accepts the offer, and delivers to Namor a message on Magneto's behalf, one that will lure him away from his throne, and thus leave it vulnerable to be stolen. But we don't get a chance to hear this message just yet, as the issue shifts focus back to the X-Men, who are being briefed by the professor on an upcoming mission. They're going to be confronting Magneto at his secret island headquarters, hopefully before he's convinced Namor to join him. But seeing as the location of his headquarters is supposedly a secret, Bobby questions how they'll be able to find it. So the professor explains that a freighter ship in the North Atlantic had recently encountered strange magnetic signals that were disrupting its navigational compass. Traveling to the source of these signals, the ship discovered a small island housing a massive magnetic device. But before they could investigate any further, their ship was lifted off of the ocean by an invisible force and carried hundreds of miles away. Looking into this strange incident, Professor X deduced that Magneto must have been behind it, and was able to discern the rough location of his hideout. Now it's just a matter of getting there, except that it's no matter at all, as for some reason the professor already owns a large sailing ship. So he and the X-Men depart immediately, but the issue skips past several hours of tedious sailing, and picks up with them as they're close to Magneto's island, but have yet to spot land. So the professor sends out Angel to begin scouting the skies, but he doesn't find any trace of the island either. So he then decides to use a special camera that can see farther than any of them, and orders Marvel Girl to raise it as high as she can, with her telekinesis. But this effort fails just the same, so the professor orders the Beast to climb the ship's mast and retrieve the camera. He happily obliges, but cluelessly grabs onto a frayed rope to reach it. Thus it snaps under his weight, and the Beast begins plummeting towards the ground. Marvel Girl manages to slow his descent, but her telekinesis begins buckling under his weight, so Iceman rushes in to save the day, and cushions the Beast's eventual fall with a nice pile of snow. But with that, the issue shifts focus back to Namor, who's just been told of Magneto by his scheming servant. At first, Namor thinks nothing of the villain, and scoffs at the idea of working with him. But when the servant tells him that Magneto is a mutant, and that he is one himself, Namor begins to reconsider. You see, Namor holds a special hatred for humanity, and has sworn to never partner himself with another human. But Magneto is not a human, and shares a similar hatred for the race. Thus it only makes sense that they'd team up, but Namor's still skeptical, as after all, he's never met the villain. So that's what he sets out to do, as he boards an Atlantean submarine and heads out for Magneto's island. He arrives there only a short time later, and is immediately greeted by the villain. But Namor is a king, and as such, silences Magneto for speaking in his presence without being recognized. While Magneto would normally balk at such blatant disrespect, he's eager to get on Namor's good side, and thus remains silent. He begins scouting the island for traps. But this doesn't mean that Magneto isn't eager to control him. In fact, the opposite is true, as he decides to introduce him to the Scarlet Witch, in the hopes that her beauty will overwhelm him and thus make him easier to influence. While this might seem rather far-fetched, it's actually rooted in precedent, as Namor fell in love with the Invisible Girl from the moment he saw her. So Scarlet Witch goes to greet him, and seeing that he's closely inspecting the island and is distracted, she opts to introduce herself by tapping him on the shoulder. But oddly enough, the same motion to tap someone on the shoulder is the one that she uses to activate her hex power. So she accidentally causes a set of nearby wires to begin spitting electricity right at Namor. But in an amazing feat of durability, he harmlessly rips them away. The Scarlet Witch immediately apologizes to him, but before he can either forgive her or retaliate, the Angel suddenly swoops in out of nowhere. But apparently he's not there to fight, but to deliver a message to Magneto, one concerning Namor. But the villain isn't in the mood for any messages, and begins hurling boulders at the Angel. The young hero's luckily able to dodge them, but he's not quick enough to avoid Namor, who flies up and catches him in midair. Despite being caught in the submariner's grip, the Angel foolishly decides to gloat, and remarks that he can easily outmaneuver him in the air. While Namor admits that this is true, he then questions what good maneuverability is, when compared to his overwhelming strength. It's an apt question, as Namor then hurls the Angel all the way back to the X-Men ship, which is anchored hundreds of feet offshore. But this is actually what Angel had been hoping for, as he immediately rushes to Professor X, and tells him that Namor's on the island and working with Magneto. Thus it seems that they're too late, and there's nothing left to do but fight it out. So the professor orders his students to get ready for battle. Magneto's doing the same, except that he'd rather skip the drawn-out brawl, and vanquish the X-Men right then and there. So he's aimed a giant magnetic ray right at the hero's ship, and without hesitation, fires on them. The ship is destroyed in mere seconds, but miraculously, all of the X-Men and Professor X survive its destruction, and they simply tread water until Iceman crafts an ice bridge for them to walk on. While obviously the professor can't swim, the Beast keeps him afloat with his superhuman strength, and then places him onto the ice bridge once it's complete. And once it is, the 5 X-Men and their teacher bravely head onto shore to confront the Brotherhood and Magneto. But just as they reach the beachhead, a massive spiny root suddenly springs up and blocks their path. While the X-Men confusedly settle on destroying it, the professor knows that there's a far easier way to get past it, and orders Cyclops to walk right into one of its large thorns. Being the ever-obedient student that he is, Cyclops obeys the command without question, and is relieved to discover that it's just another one of Mastermind's harmless illusions. With this obstacle out of the way, Cyclops then rushes onto the island and heads for its giant magnetic ray. But before he can destroy it with an optic beam, he's ambushed from behind by Quicksilver. Cyclops tries to blast away the speedy mutant, but he's too fast for him, and he just ends up exhausting his beam. Thus it seems that the hero's already been defeated, but he's luckily saved in the nick of time by Marvel Girl, who levitates Quicksilver high in the air, and then dizzyingly drops him into the arms of the Beast. Watching this from within the island's fortress is the Scarlet Witch, who begs Magneto to do something to save her brother. But the mad villain claims that Quicksilver is as good as dead, as he's about to activate a magnetic machine that will annihilate both him and the X-Men, which he views as a necessary sacrifice. The Scarlet Witch naturally protests this, but Magneto disregards her concern and rudely silences her. Listening to their conversation is the chivalrous Namor, who's furiously offended that Magneto would speak so rudely to a woman. He's in fact so outraged that he suddenly destroys the villain's magnetic machine as punishment. Magneto obviously doesn't take kindly to this, and vengefully attacks Namor with a swarm of broken machine parts. Namor actually finds himself overwhelmed, and it seems that Magneto might just defeat him then and there. But alas, they'll have to fight another day, as their brief battle is interrupted by the sudden arrival of the X-Men. Interestingly, neither Magneto nor Namor stick around to fight them, leaving only Toad and Mastermind to defend the island. But only the latter bothers to do much of anything, as he blankets the team in a thick illusory fog, which he and Toad use as cover to flee deeper into the island's fortress, along with Magneto. While the Scarlet Witch is offered a chance to join them, she refuses, as she's not going to abandon her brother. So she goes to confront the X-Men, who themselves are confronting Namor. She orders them to let her Quicksilver go, but they of course refuse, and remark that she's not in any position to make demands. While this might be true, Namor, by virtue of his incredible power, is. So he comes to her aid, and orders the X-Men to do as she says. But they aren't intimidated by him, and remain steadfast in their position. The Beast especially isn't impressed, and even mocks Namor right to his face. As you might expect, the ill-tempered prince reacts to this by swiping at the Beast, but the young hero is too agile and dodges the blow. Surprisingly, Namor doesn't go for a second strike, but instead opts to stand perfectly still and let the Beast wail on him. Thus it becomes obvious just how powerful the Atlantean is, as none of the Beast's many strikes even faze him. Rather foolishly, the Angel thinks that he might fare better, and thus rushes in to save his teammate and defeat Namor. But of course he doesn't fare any better, as Namor simply picks up the Beast and shoves him into the Angel, taking them both out of the fight. So now it's Cyclops' turn, and to his credit, Namor's briefly overwhelmed by the power of his optic beam. But the key word is briefly, as it's then that the Scarlet Witch sneaks up behind him, and uses her hex power to loosen the ground that he's standing on. So he momentarily loses his balance, directs his beam away from Namor, and gives the villain enough time to potentially strike back. But just before he does, he, and everyone else's mind is suddenly pierced by a powerful mental command. It's the Professor, who's arrived, with Marvel Girl and Quicksilver to cease the battle. You might be wondering why Quicksilver would join forces with the Professor. Well, it turns out that he hasn't, as he's actually been mentally hypnotized, and is just there to show the Scarlet Witch that he's unharmed. But she's still concerned for him, and pleads with the Professor to let him go. While he refuses, he tells her that she has nothing to worry about, as his fight is not with her, or Namor, but with Magneto. As she, her brother, and the Atlantean prince, are nothing but pawns to him. But this was perhaps a poor choice of words, as Namor takes offense to being called a pawn, and furiously rips out a chunk of the earth to hurl at the Professor. While the X-Men immediately rush to his aid, he orders them to stand by, as he knows that Namor is not a killer, and won't attack them unless they provoke him. And it turns out that he's right, as Namor then harmlessly hurls the boulder away, and admits that it was a mistake to join forces with Magneto. But this doesn't mean that he's going to work with the X-Men either. Instead, he decides to simply leave in frustration, but not before vowing to one day return and conquer the surface world. So the X-Men let him go, and the professor frees Quicksilver of his mental grasp, as he's going to need all of his power in their coming battle against Magneto. But speaking of the villain, the issue suddenly shifts focus to him, along with Toad and Mastermind, as they're climbing atop the island's massive magnetic ray. He's planning on using it against Namor, both to punish him for betraying him, and to make sure that he can't ever join the X-Men. So that's what he does, by blasting the unsuspecting prince with a torrent of unrelenting magnetic energy. Its incredible power forces him to the ground, as if his body's been magnetized to the island itself. It's like nothing that the Atlantean has ever faced before, but he still manages to muster enough strength to mightily smash the ground beneath him. Incredibly, the force of his pound sends shockwaves throughout the entire island, and loosens the magnetic ray off of its foundation. Thus it crumbles to the ground, and frees Namor from his magnetic bonds. But he's done fighting, and instead of retaliating against Magneto, he simply dives into the ocean, and leaves. But Magneto's been defeated nonetheless, and orders his Brotherhood to flee into an escape shuttle. Surprisingly, Professor X allows Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch to join them, as they're still loyal to Magneto, and he's not going to force them to join the X-Men. With that, the issue subsequently ends as the Beast and Iceman discover that Magneto's abandoned a sailing ship, giving them a way to get back home. That concludes Uncanny X-Men 6, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid, but somewhat tired story. While I certainly enjoyed seeing Namor battle the X-Men, this is the third issue in a row where they fight Magneto and his Brotherhood, only for the villains to escape at the last minute. At this point, Magneto's been the villain in 2/3 of the X-Men issues. While I do enjoy him as a character, I think it's about time that the X-Men face someone new. Thus I'm left somewhat disappointed in knowing that the next issue is yet another, in which the X-Men face off against Magneto and his Brotherhood. But I'd also like to mention how boring and static the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver have become. In their first appearance, they were willingly working with Magneto, but it was obvious that they weren't truly villains. Fast forward 3 issues later, and for some reason, despite having seen him do, or promised to do, some of the most vile things one can imagine, they're still working with him. Eventually, these two are supposed to become heroes, but it's going to be pretty hard for me to forgive them for being so complacent in Magneto's schemes. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.